Hi, I'm Isaiah,
Hi, I'm Kelly.
and this is Teaching Climate Together. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Kelly Herbenson, the Executive Director at the Mojave Desert Land Trust Organization. Thank you so much for being here today.
Of course, I'm so happy to be here.
Now, I've never really interacted much with the deserts other than seeing them in pictures and movies and, being seen as this very hot, dry based environment. And I'm very excited to learn more about this concept around desert conservation and what that means for you.
Yeah, well, the desert ecosystem, I think a lot of people don't realize, is actually a quarter of the state of California. It's 26 million acres just in our state, and that's the Mojave and Colorado desert region. And it's a really special place in a way that I think people don't realize. It's actually incredibly biodiverse. There are more than, for example, 2,400 species of native plants here alone, and not to mention the thousands and thousands of other species of plants and animals that call this home. And it's just a really unique ecosystem that, just like anywhere else on the planet, is really important for us to know about and protect as much as possible.
Absolutely. And I'm very curious about your role here at the Mojave Desert Land Trust. What is the importance around the mechanisms and works that you do here and the importance for desert ecosystems?
Because it is a big part of our state, and actually the sort of desert ecosystem in the United States is one of the remaining mostly intact ecosystems that we have in the lower 48. So it stretches, of course, throughout the Southwest. And for that reason, we have an opportunity to protect it still. And so our role here at the Mojave Desert Land Trust is thinking about everything that we can do to make sure that that desert ecosystem in California is maintained as a functioning ecosystem. So it's doing all those important things like sequestering carbon and helping regulate climate, and just housing this incredible biodiversity, including humans, for as long as possible. So we call ourselves a one-stop shop for desert conservation because we do land acquisition and management. We've protected over 120,000 acres of desert, California desert, since we started in 2006. And we have, as you can see here, a native plant nursery where we grow plants for restoration and to sell in community plant sales. And then we also have a Mojave Desert Seed Bank where we bank native seeds as an insurance policy for the future. And then we also have a really extraordinary outreach and education program where we really try to center people in the work that we do. And we know that conservation doesn't stop with just buying land, right?
Yes.
We have to do a lot of work to protect it, and a lot of that means getting the community involved and having them, feel ownership over that work. So we do a lot of outreach and school education and that kind of thing.
Many of the times when we talk about ecology, we think about wildlife ecology, we think about coastal ecologies, but we don't really think much about desert ecologies. And I'm very curious to learn more about your specific journey in studying biology and how that got you into desert ecosystem work.
So I went to school for ecology and just wanted to be a field biologist. I just wanted to learn about all of the incredible plants and animals we have. I grew up in Southern California and ended up all over the place. I lived in Montana for a while studying trout, and I lived in Northern California for a while studying insects. And I was offered a job at some point doing surveys for desert tortoises in Barstow when I was 22. And I just, drove my pickup truck to Barstow and was pretty unsure about it. I'd never really been to the desert or thought about it or experienced it. And I worked surveying for tortoises, and I remember very clearly the day I saw my first tortoise. And I was just walking in the desert, and it was springtime, and this tortoise just walked out of her burrow and and we sort of like met eyes with each other. And it was this
my
really
God.
oddly profound, experience connecting with wildlife like that. And I just remember being like, there's like this dinosaur that lives here and no one's talking about it. Like, this is so incredible. And I didn't really know that there were tortoises in the desert. Like,
Me
that's
neither. Yeah, I didn't know
not
that
something
either.
people think about. There's this, species that's been here for a very long time that is so incredible, and it's so threatened, and it just changed my life.
When you come to the desert here in Mojave, you see these like beautiful Western Joshua trees, and I'm very curious to know what's the relationship with that plant species in the land and what's going on with them right now.
So the Western Joshua tree has been at the forefront of desert conservation recently because we've learned more and more as climate change has been in the forefront of all of our minds, right? Especially in the last decade or so. The Joshua tree is one that has been identified as particularly vulnerable to a changing climate. And the reason for that is that they're not able to migrate. They're not able to adapt to that changing climate. They would migrate very slowly in tiny increments. However, the climate is changing so fast that the trees aren't able to adapt. And so what is predicted, so in all of these sort of climate models coming out, is looking at what's likely to happen in the future. If we just keep going on business as usual and not making changes to how we live. For example, in Joshua Tree National Park, there will only be about 2% of their range left that will be suitable habitat in the next 100 years. So we're looking at a really, a crisis for that species. So MDLT, along with, lots of partners and agencies, have been trying to think about what we can do to protect it. And the state recently passed the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. And that is designed to sort of create a structure for us to think about how we can protect that species moving forward.
I wanted to know like how the Western Joshua tree is different from the other Joshua trees that we see in different landscapes and the species that pollinates this tree. I really am curious to learn, like, is there a specific species that helps this tree?
Yes, this is my favorite subject, which I keep saying everything's my favorite
Yes.
subject. But so we have a Western Joshua tree that obviously lives in the western part of the Mojave, most of the California range and into Nevada. And then there's also an Eastern Joshua tree species that there's a little pocket of California that has eastern trees and into Nevada and Arizona. And they have slightly different sort of branching that happens. If you saw them side by side, you'd say, oh, this one's sort of taller and leggier, and this one's more compact. But one of the coolest things about Joshua trees is they each have their own pollinator. It's a tiny little yucca moth, and they're these really not very charismatic insects. They're about an inch long, and they're sort of white or gray, and they have what we call an obligate mutualism, which is a fancy way of saying that pollinator relies on the Joshua tree. It can't pollinate anything else. It relies on it for its fruit. And the Joshua tree relies on that pollinator. It can't have anything else pollinate it. So we're starting to learn more and more about Joshua trees, and we know very little about that moth. So insects like that tend to be really poorly understood. We just don't have enough people dedicating their lives to studying the ecology of a little moth. So I always tell people, if they want to help, that's something we need, is going to school for moth ecology and learning, because without the moth, the Joshua tree certainly will go extinct, and vice versa.
Of course, and this is no hate to butterflies, but we
Yeah.
love the moths too. We have to preach for them too.
Yes.
And one of the things I've actually been learning more about this landscape is the threat of projects going. And sometimes this is a bit of a controversial topic, and I would love to learn more about what are the threats that the Mojave Desert landscape really is facing, and how you as an ecologist are very situated in this unique intersections of trying to understand different parties.
So, like I said before, the desert is this relatively intact ecosystem. And we often talk about the necessity of our ecosystems functioning appropriately, meaning that they're doing things like sequestering carbon and nurturing all the pollinators we need and creating oxygen and all these things, and humans really deeply rely on them. And so our work is really making sure that ecosystem continues to function and stays connected. But at the same time, we have a growing population and growing threats and needs, and habitat loss is probably, next to climate change, the biggest threat to the desert ecosystem functioning. As we all know, climate change is the biggest existential threat to our species and every species and all of this working. And, we know that a swift divestment from fossil fuels is the most important thing that needs to happen. However, the renewable energy development and the amount of renewable energy we need, a lot of that development is happening in the desert. People don't realize all the time that those solar plants have to go somewhere. And guess where has the most solar energy? The desert. So not only does the desert have a lot of solar energy because of the intensity of the sunlight here, but there's a lot of land. And there's this sort of perception that the desert isn't a very biodiverse place.
And that there's nothing there and that there should be development.
Yeah. So there is a lot of renewable energy development pressure here in the desert. And it's something here at MDLT we think a lot about because it's a really complicated issue, right? Like we know that we need renewable energy and we know that we need everything we can to fight climate change. But the renewable energy development is also impacting the connectivity and the biodiversity in the desert. We're really lucky in California. About 15 years ago, all of the federal and state agencies and a bunch of NGOs got together and created the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. Yes. The idea was to look at how all of this development is affecting the desert. And it was a really great idea, and I think saved us from there being a really terrible impact from that development by creating specific, they call them development focal areas, where the solar is restricted to developing in certain areas that have been identified as not as ecologically important as others. So we at MDLT really work to make sure that those developments are abiding by that tool so that we can really focus on protecting areas that aren't impeding the renewable energy development, but are really working to maintain that connectivity.
I love that because I think, it's a very nuanced discussion and there are solutions. We're not trying to say we're anti-renewables, but this is something very realistic where I think that sometimes when we think about different industries, we tend to think in a very siloed way of like, this is the future forward, but then we are disregarding the other industries and like conservation, for example. So there needs to be more collaborations with business leaders and scientists and policymakers. This is something that really needs to be understood from all parties.
We have these big issues and we really need some creative and bold and innovative solutions. And the only way we're going to do it is by all working together.
I wanted to ask you more if you can share about your experiences of where you've had to really push back and really understand, like there's a lot of people watching this that are maybe struggling with trying to understand if this is the right career path for them. And if you have any advice to share, that'd be really great.
We set education up in an interesting way where you're so young when you're going to college, and it can be intimidating because it's this process of learning. And I know I certainly sort of pursued my path feeling like I don't know anything. I'm just taking it all in, and I guess this person is right. But, we're in a new time. We're in a situation with climate change that is really severe. And I think, the only way we're going to make it through is by people having ideas that are different. Because, business as usual isn't going to work. The things that we learned in college, aren't working. Maybe they're working some, but we need big, bold, creative, innovative ideas. And so I know I always say, question everything. We're all trying our best to think about ways to do something, and there is no clear roadmap for how we're going to fight climate change. It's not laid out for us. There's no clear roadmap for how to protect the desert. So we have a team that works together, and all of us are like, okay, put it on the table. What can we try?
We are here today at the Seed Lab at the Mojave Desert Land Trust, and I'm joined by Medina Asbel, the Director of Plant Conservation Programs for the Mojave Desert Land Trust. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm very invested in seed banks and wanting to learn the importance. So my general knowledge is that in Antarctica, everyone knows about the seed bank, but no one knows that the desert has its own seed bank here.
Yes, the Mojave Desert has a seed bank here at the Land Trust, and our mission is to preserve all the seeds of all the species that call the Mojave Desert home.
So what was the development of getting the seed bank live and the importance? I know that in our previous guest speakers, we've had different conversations around different species going endangered, and why is it that it's so important to start saving seeds now?
So plants in the desert especially don't produce seed every year. So because our climate is so unpredictable, we don't necessarily have a good rainy season every year. That's why super blooms are so exciting, because they're not a guarantee. And that means that if we are going to restore desert ecosystems, we can't rely on the seed to be there when we need it. We need to be out collecting seed proactively when the seed is available, so that we'll have it when we need it, when we need to do restoration. With every collection, we collect a lot of field data, and so every collection has a form like this that tells us when and where we made the collection, how many individual plants we collected off of, and the size of that population. So this collection here is a plant called Phacelia crenulata. And so I put some seeds under the microscope for you to look at if you like.
Oh, cool. So is this like a cross section of the seed, or just more the front and back?
This is the front and the back of the seed.
They're so beautiful too.
They are. What a lot of people may not realize is seeds are alive. They're little plant embryos, and each seed will eventually become its own plant. So I brought a sample here of the screwbean mesquite. These are fun. These are also very, very labor intensive to clean, because each one of these coils has a lot of seeds inside, and the seeds are actually really small. And so that's what these are. You can see what looks, can you see that? That's a larva.
Oh yes, the little
beetle.
dot, the little black dot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see that in there. I'd love to learn more about the other processes of scanning it. Would love for you to show me that part.
Yeah, we can look at the seed blower.
Cool. I'm very curious to see, what is this machine? It looks like a barista machine, but maybe I'm being a little bit too honest here.
So this is a seed blower, and this is a great tool that we use to process seeds. It helps us get the chaff, so all that extraneous material, parts of flowers and twigs and leaves and stuff, out of our seed collection. And it does that with air by blowing air up through the tube and separating the seed and the chaff by weight, because the lighter material goes up and into the cups, and the heavier material, which is usually the seed, ends up at the bottom in the cup. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you now. The seeds have been extracted from the pods. They're the gray. They're really beautiful.
Wow.
And so this cup has a screen on the bottom that allows air through. So I'm going to put the collection in here, and you saw all that dust. We want to get that out. And then we put our cup in the bottom of the tube, and then make sure that this vent up here is closed. And then I turn it on. And when I do that, air wants to come up through this tube. And I slowly open the vent, and watch what's happening down here. that is what
it's
controls the
going up,
airflow. Yeah, so the more I open the vent, the stronger the airflow is, and it starts to blow more and more of that chaff up into the cups. So it goes up and then into one of the two
and it
cups.
separates them by their weight. So
Yeah. And so once it stops blowing, I now have a much cleaner, batch of seeds here. So once we take that out, it's pretty much almost entirely clean.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So after we do this, what is the next step?
So the next step would be to print out a label that has the species name, the accession number, and the number of seeds in the collection, and then put it into the vault. So the germination chamber is what allows us to test the germination rate of our seed collections. And it looks like a refrigerator, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. It allows us to control the light and the temperature throughout the day. And so we can adjust the settings, we can customize it so that the temperature only reaches 60 degrees or 30 degrees at night. We can set the lighting to go on and off at different times and be a certain intensity. And what that allows us to do is grow those seeds out at the conditions that are optimal for them, because it's not the same for everything. And we can do that year round. We don't have to wait for the right time of year. We can test our seed at any time. This is actually an experiment that we're doing on a species that's really difficult to germinate, and we're working with the Bureau of Land Management to figure out what the seeds require in order to wake them up and what we call break dormancy. Because this particular plant, it's called Chilesmia brevipes. It's one of the desert tortoise's favorite food plants. And one thing we would really like to be able to do is to regenerate this seed and restore desert tortoise habitat.
We learned so much about the importance of identifying, storing, and processing. And my question is, with the seeds, are we collecting all the plants? Or right now we see plants that are alive, like the Western Joshua tree. Do you need to collect those seeds too?
The Joshua tree is a really good example because it does something called masting. And that is where the population doesn't flower every year. In fact, it flowers fairly infrequently and unpredictably. When it does flower, they all flower. And so Joshua trees can go for multiple years without blooming. And when they don't bloom, they don't produce seed. There's a direct connection there between the flower and the seed. And it's important for us to be able to go out and make those collections when we can, and then store that seed for future use. So this is just one of the vaults that has our collections in it. And this is an example of a Joshua tree seed collection.
And these are how many seeds are in there?
So there are about 14,000 seeds. This is one of 3 jars in this collection, and so this is probably about a third of that. Oh. Yeah. Once you start working with seeds start to develop their own personalities.
Looks like popcorn.
And I don't know if you can see how fluffy they are.
Oh, they're like little bunnies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for being here with us, and also just teaching us the importance about seed banking, seed conservation.
You're so welcome, and thank you for coming and talking to us and letting us share what we do.
I'm so happy to be joined today with Sarah Bliss, the Director of Land Conservation here at the Mojave Desert Land Trust. And one of those aspects that we really want to talk about is Indigenous history and the continued relationships of how Indigenous communities have always and still contribute to so much ecosystem restoration. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I'd love to learn more about, first of all, it's so important for us to know and acknowledge the Indigenous lands that we may reside on. And I wanted to ask you more about the history of this ecological landscape.
We're on the traditional lands of the Serrano, Cahuilla, Chemehuevi, and Mojave people. When we took a little, we have the tour out in our nursery and ethnobotanical garden. With that, we also gave acknowledgement to that landscape there. And then you could see that it was connected to the Oasis of Mara, and that's kind of the beginning of the history of this area. So the Oasis of Mara is located in what is now known as 29 Palms. And that was the place and is the place of creation for the Serrano people. And then throughout history, the Chemehuevi people traveled to the oasis. And in the 1800s, they were actually in a war with another tribe. And because they passed through this area, they also knew that the oasis was a place of safety. And so this is a really big kind of cultural kind of hub right here, where there would be trade, there would be gatherings. And it was not until recently that a lot of these gatherings started to happen again, with the conflicts, with their children taken away, and also with their, with government services not wanting to come out here. All of these things that happened in the 1900s really made it difficult for tribal members to be able to live out here. Now today, and actually within the past like 15, 20 years, the bird songs have come back. There was I think within the past 10 years, there was actually a gathering of the Chemehuevi people at the Oasis of Mara again. I think we're at a turning point in the history of the narrative of this area in the Morongo Basin and bringing that real history back to the area.
In your work, you talk about like tribal data sovereignty, and I was very invested as from your perspective of coming from a cultural resource management perspective, how you tie that in.
Especially when I was working as a tribal representative in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, was that you would have like a lot of like biologists and archaeologists. They want to take the data and, even data that is the tribe's data, like a lot of these information about archaeological sites, a lot of these agencies wouldn't give tribes that information because they're like, well, what are you going to be doing with it unless you sign some agreement that you're not going to, damage this area. And one of our big projects is the tribal nursery and seed bank. And a bit where that ties into tribal data sovereignty is that, we have all this information about seeds, and tribes have all this information about seeds, and we want to make sure that we are going about it in a culturally appropriate manner. So sometimes there is data that the tribes have to protect, and we don't need to know, even when it comes to like seed collection or gathering, or even going to some of these landscapes. And so with tribal data sovereignty, it's a whole realm of protection of cultural resources, of landscapes, of plants and materials. So it's this kind of whole box to open up, but a really kind of interesting topic to start to discuss.
Now, I really wanted to talk about the ways in which the Ethnobotany garden that's outside of ways of using Indigenous ecological knowledge, but also reverence for these communities and understanding that it's an active basis. Some of the species that we saw outside that you listed, I'd love to talk more about that, and also the methodologies that were used to ensure that there is this active collaboration and remembrance, not just from having the species, but the ways that we present things too.
There's a lot of intentionality throughout the ethnobotanical garden. It was, not only funded, but supported by the San Manuel tribe. When you go throughout the garden, you can see that the tribal name in Serrano is first on the list. And so this is a total kind of switch around of kind of that traditional perspective of like, oh, Western science is first, and changes that narrative to, no, we want to give acknowledgement to the traditional language and lands. As you see throughout the garden as well, a lot of people think that the desert, they're like, oh, is this like a wasteland? But when I've gone out with tribal elders, it's like, oh, this is a bountiful garden or pantry. There's so much out here. So with ethnobotany, it's not just looking at the plant, but looking at the cultural connection, the cultural history, and that relationship and the human relationship with the plants.
For a lot of people who I would say are non-Indigenous and maybe don't have a relationship or don't live near those landscapes, how is it that they can show up for these communities, but also organizations like the Mojave to ensure that there is this constant understanding of how people can pay reverence without having to interact and ask those questions?
There's always this big question, or like this big thing about land acknowledgement. And with that, you know, it's what is the action that you're doing beyond land acknowledgement? Because anyone can give a land acknowledgement, but what's the intentionality beyond that? We give reference to the traditional lands that we're on. And so that's something that, like, you know, people can do every day, is that there are a lot of resources like nativeland.ca that you can actually see where you are and throughout the whole world see whose land you're on. Check out tribal websites. That is the tribes telling their story in the way that they want told. And that is, I think, the best perspective that you can get when you're trying to learn about tribal history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sarah Bliss, for joining us here today for us to learn more about the importance of Indigenous ecological systems and understanding that this isn't an end conversation. It's in continuity, that we're constantly having to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Estoy aquí con Yanina Aldo Galvan, the project coordinator for the Lands Department. Gracias por being here.
Gracias a vos por invitarme.
Y yo quiero saber más de tu historia porque yo soy un ambientalista latino y tú eres una ambientalista latina y quiero aprender más de tu historia de este trabajo que haces.
Bueno, te cuento un poquito cómo llegué a Estados Unidos. Sí. Yo llegué hace 20 años a Estados Unidos con $25 y una maleta y decidí quedarme aquí en Estados Unidos después de que me enamoré de California. Soy de Argentina y en Argentina había estudiado agricultural science, agronomía. Sí. Y me quedé ahí trabajando con ranchos y con ganadería. Y después me vine aquí a Joshua Tree. Y en Joshua Tree empecé a trabajar aquí en Mojave Desert Land Trust como Land Steward, que como Natural Resource Technician. Una pasión mía es proteger California y la biodiversidad de California. California es uno de los lugares más biodiversos del mundo. Pero además tiene una de las poblaciones más grandes del mundo. Entonces es muy importante poder proteger la biodiversidad, no solamente la fauna y la flora, pero la biodiversidad cultural también, ¿no? Porque biodiversidad somos todos, es todo. El ser humano no está disociado de la biodiversidad, somos parte también.
Pues me da mucho gusto y también quiero saber más qué vamos a hacer aquí, porque yo creí que este era una tortuga, me asusté.
Esta es una caparazón de tortuga. Nombre científico es Gopherus agassizii. Y es endémica del desierto del Mojave. La tortuga del desierto está en peligro de extinción. Solamente quedan 10 a 30 por kilómetro cuadrado. En 30 años se ha reducido la población de las tortugas un 90%, desde 1990.
¿Y eso es porque hay muchas construcciones de proyectos de casas o de cambio climático?
No, tiene más que ver con las construcciones de las casas, pero también con, le dicen como ranchos solares. Cada vez, o sea, hay una cuestión para ver en la energía renovable, que hay veces que no todo lo que brilla es oro. Y no es que la energía renovable no sea buena, pero de la forma que se hace y dónde se hace.
¿Cómo puedo trabajar para ayudar a los humanos, pero también a los animales y los lugares? Y no es que queremos tener todo donde quiera, porque personas siempre creen, hay nada en el desierto, ya no hay animales, pero eso no es cierto.
No es así, no es así. La tortuga es uno y todos estos, bueno, acá lo que tenemos es un poco un cocktail nosotros le llamamos scat, que es el término un poco más científico de poop. básicamente.
Esa es realidad.
No, no son de verdad. Pero lo que tengo acá es un poco de todos los animales que viven en el desierto para que veas las huellas que dejan y también para que adivines. A ver, te voy a hacer bueno, este tiene su nombre, no te voy a decir, pero que adivines de qué es cada popó. A ver si sabes.
A ver, yo creo de... Ay, a ver, yo voy a saber. Voy a tratar.
Confía en ti.
Yo creo, pero el mountain lion es este.
Muy bien, muy bien, muy bien. Este es de Bobcat.
Yo creo de Jack Rabbit es este.
No, es de Cocoa Puffs of
Ay,
the
qué
Desert.
chulo sus orejas.
Acá tengo una, mira esta qué linda. Esta es de murciélago.
Oh, de bat.
Sí. Pero esta es de rata.
Ah, se ve como un hamster.
Sí, esta que le dicen el pack rat o la rata de madera. Y este es de chipmunk.
Ah, sí.
Aunque acá en realidad nosotros en el desierto no tenemos chipmunk. Tenemos una que se llama Mojave squirrel. Y esta es de mi favorita.
De la víbora.
Serpiente de cascabel.
Porque la cultura en Los Ángeles y también en California hay diferentes identidades de diferentes personas y pues para muchas personas cuando oyen el tema de ecología o ambientalista, a veces los latinos no se ven como... No se ven. Es muy triste porque yo entré a ecología en este espacio porque yo quería enseñar a todos los latinos que hay oportunidades aquí para salvar las personas, para salvar la comunidad y para salvar la cultura.
Es verdad. Y cuando yo empecé a trabajar, no había gente latina. No había. Yo nunca tuve un modelo que pudiera ver que hablaba español, o tuve que hacer todo desde cero. Y me ayudaron muchas mujeres ecologistas que fueron mis modelos, pero igualmente, o sea, gringas, ¿no? Y también que este lugar donde estamos, pero la conservación en general no es un ambiente dominado por la diversidad. Y la causa realmente es porque mucha gente que es latina o de otro tipo de etnias no tiene tiempo para la conservación, ¿no? Está sobreviviendo, más que todo. Sanar el planeta no es solamente una cuestión de cambio climático, es una cuestión de justicia ambiental, ¿no? O sea, las personas más afectadas siempre van a ser las personas más marginales. Cuando yo empecé a trabajar para Mojave Desert Land Trust, solamente éramos 10 personas.
Ah, nada más 10.
Sí. Éramos como 10 personas y yo tenía como 4 trabajos más o menos. Estaba como en nursery, land steward, facilities, Mi trabajo hoy en día es un poco más específico a lo que es la restauración ecológica. O sea, tomar tierras que han sido denudadas, que han sido deforestadas, que han sido quemadas, que han sido degradadas en todo sentido y volverlas a poner whole again.
¿Cómo podemos las personas como los jóvenes, es tan importante que ellos saben la importancia para salvar y yo creo que a veces no saben cómo empezar su journey. Y yo creo que es muy duro para las personas jóvenes ahorita para entregarse en carreras de ecología porque hay muchas responsabilidades que ellos necesitan tener. Yo sé como latino yo mismo, era duro para mí entrar en una carrera que está salvando la planeta, pero a veces hay diferentes, ¿cómo se dice? Expectations que necesitas tener como dinero, healthcare, como security para vivir.
Yo tengo ansiedad también, o lo que le dicen eco-anxiety.
Ah, sí.
Sí, yo tengo ansiedad, pero más tengo rabia y enojo. Y el enojo a mí me hace bien porque me ayuda a seguir todos
No
los
es tu
días.
poder.
Es mi poder, lo transforma en mi poder, es como mi fuego interno, ¿no? Para los jóvenes de hoy les digo, cualquier cosa que hagas con la lente, mirando y sabiendo de que estás haciendo algo para salvar el planeta, cualquier cosa sirve. Las redes sociales, como tú, sirve para abrir la cabeza, para abrir los ojos, sirve. Yo he tenido el placer de trabajar con jóvenes de todas las edades de la ciudad que han buscado esas organizaciones y luego se convierten en científicos, se convierten en arquitectos, diferentes cosas. Ya no podemos más quedarnos sentados. O sea, haz lo que sea, pero no te quedes sentado, ¿no? O sea, hay que buscar y hacer, hay que hacerlo. Lo que hagas está bien.
Our last guest today is Radhika Epps, that is a wisdom intern at the Mojave Desert Land Trust. And thank you so much just for being here, honestly.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so invested to know why deserts and why you chose this internship program and the importance around it.
I was born and raised in Los Angeles, so very much like urban cityscape, you know, a little bit suburbia. We didn't really have a ton of access to green spaces or anything like that, not really a lot of outdoorsy things in my childhood. When I first started getting more into environmentalism and into like anthropology and archaeology, one of my big passions is like conservation. And I think we talk a lot about forests and the mountains and, you know, like water and the ocean, stuff like that, but very rarely had I ever heard of conservation in the desert. And so when I was looking for projects and internships to work with that did conservation and I saw something in the desert, I was like, oh, this is an amazing opportunity to kind of venture someplace that I'd never been. Because I'd grown up more, I mean, I don't know if like everyone who's grown up in an urban landscape thinks like this, but I was like, oh, the desert is dead. Like there's nothing out there.
Too.
Exactly, like it's hot, there's sand, I don't know, tumbleweeds, like, I don't know, you don't really think of there being a ton of life or biodiversity out here, but we came out here and the first thing I noticed was that it was like surprisingly lush. Like that's not really a term I thought I'd ever use in the desert, but there's so much life. There are so many plants and so many animals. And our assignment were at springs, which really surprised me because I was like, water in the desert in California? Like I've never heard of that. It was so incredible, honestly, to see that much life and beauty in a place that I'd always thought was very sparse. And I got the opportunity to really connect with nature in a way that I hadn't before. I remembered that one of the first times I ever felt really connected to nature was in 7th grade, and my history teacher, Bill Johnson, I love him. He like completely changed my life.
Hero. Yeah, educators are the best.
Honestly. He would schedule all of these field trips, like outside of school time, to make sure that we had time to do them. And one of them was out to the sand dunes. After sunset, we climbed up one of the sand dunes and he just made us sit in silence for like 10 minutes. So obviously as like a 12-year-old, that was the hardest thing ever. But we sat in silence and we looked up at the stars and I was like, oh, like I'm so lucky. Like this is such a privilege to have access to this space, but also to be able to connect with nature in this way. And I was like, I think I want to try and find something like where I can do this for the rest of my life. And now, you know, I have the opportunity to do it through internships like Wisdom, so.
Absolutely, and I'm very curious to know, what was the specific project in the internship that you focused on? Was it just like a multitude of different things that you would do from seed collection, or was it more focused on like the research base on that end?
Wisdom kind of let us do a little bit of everything. So after the first 2 visits, we had 6 or 7 visits in total out into the desert, and we would drive out in the mornings and we'd go to the springs and we would look at water levels. So we'd see like how much water would come from like the underground springs. We'd take pictures. We mapped out the spring itself. So there were little areas where like the spring started. And then we went to Teresa and Bernangeles. Those were our 2 springs that we visited. And I remember Teresa was huge. Like that spring, there were all these beautiful rock canyons and formations and we walked down them and we charted them. And Mary actually gave us access to Wisdom's ArcGIS account, and we were able to like visually map out the spring and like the depth.
What does the Wisdom program stand for?
It stands for Women in Science Discovering Our Mojave, which I think is just such a, first of all, such a good acronym, but also really shows the message of what the program is at heart. And it's not just women, like I'm non-binary.
Yeah.
So I think the beautiful thing about the Wisdom program is that it's so inclusive, and it's basically anyone from a marginalized community or marginalized background. They say we have funding, and we will help you learn about these amazing topics and help you find different routes and pathways into environmental protection and conservation that I think that a lot of people don't really have access to or really the ability to get into. I think it's very almost like beginner friendly. Like it's a great entryway into like science and the STEM field, and I think that it does a really good job also at like diversifying what STEM means, because I know a lot of people think STEM, they're like, okay, engineering or math, and it's like very technical. And not to say that environmentalism isn't technical at times, but I think Wisdom really shines a great light on just how much impact and value and work goes into being an environmentalist and doing what like young environmental researchers and interns have to offer to this field.
You know, for so many young people, I always get asked, like, you know, people that are in undergrad, they're like, how do I start? Because I feel so helpless. And I feel that, you know, a lot of young people today have such a unique challenge with the natural environment, like with climate change and injustices that exist in our system. It almost seems at times really hard to give hope to people. And I feel that you are someone that not so much like, not trying to say like, oh, you give me hope, but more like you're doing what you want to do, and that showcases so much solutions that are happening right now. But I feel like people that are younger than me feel so disempowered, and how would you tell them to get involved?
I think honestly the biggest thing is knowing how and where to just find community in the first place. I feel like younger generations, like I'm part of Gen Z, and then we have Gen Alpha, and I know like the joke is that we're all terminally online or whatever, but I actually think that it's a beautiful thing that we're all so technologically advanced and adept, because that's where I've been able to find a lot of my community, and where I've been able to find so many opportunities that allow me to connect with people who think similarly. Like I've gone to like environmental protests because I've seen someone at my school posted something on Instagram. And like Jane Fonda is having a talk about her career as an environmentalist at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. And I never would have known about that if I didn't follow their TikTok. And so I think the biggest thing is that understanding that every small thing we do really does make an impact. I feel like we get fed a lot of kind of doomsday mentality ideas where it's like, oh, well, climate change is gonna wreck everything, so why should we bother? Or, you know, it's big corporations that are causing the issues for like overspending or for climate change. And so like me driving like a gas car or me using plastic items doesn't make a difference, because we're just one person, or you're an individual. But I think that understanding that your footprint really can carry a lot of weight is such an important thing. So even just starting with yourself is a really good way to start finding hope. And in little things, like if you have the choice over like using a metal straw versus a plastic straw, or even just like sitting down and reading. I feel like educating yourself is a really, really great way if you have access to public libraries. There are so many sources that allow you to really start understanding what niche in the environment, or what niche in like helping change and protect our planet can be available to you. And yeah, I would just say starting small and not like trying to overwhelm yourself is a really good way.
One of the things that we talked previously with our other speakers, like about the representation for Latinos, but we also the representation for Black environmentalists to be really represented in this space, because when you look at data sets for like environmental science, for example, Black environmentalists they don't get environmental science degree. They actually are less percentage than like Latino environmentalists, and there needs to be a more push to ensure that Black and brown communities understand like we're fighting the same fight, and that we need to be able to showcase that diversity.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's one of my biggest pushes is for intersectionality. And also I think that I study anthropology, right? So culture is a huge thing in our field. Like that's the first thing they teach us. Culture is everything. It defines how we act. It defines how we think. And one of the biggest things I've learned with empowerment and learning how to empower different marginalized groups and how to find empowerment myself is the idea that we are all, like you said, we're all kind of fighting the same struggles and we're all fighting the same battles. And one of the easiest ways to combat, I think, a lot of the issues that we face is to find intersectional communities and intersectional ways of life. When you start to go beyond a Western, you know, like kind of cis-het idea of environment and protection, you really start to get at the meat of what conservation and protection is. And I think that wisdom in general, that program is sort of the entry point into that, where they're saying, okay, we see that there are all of these different identities and communities and cultures and backgrounds. Let's find a way to get these people together where they can share all of these things and start to bring a new foundation of what environmentalism and protection is.
It's honestly been such a privilege to talk to you, and I feel that, every time when we learn about these discussions, it's so important that we bring different generation conversation, because I think it's honestly the power of the youth for the future movement that are really going to redefine this industry and also pave us for an ecological safe future. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Many people have been in various ecosystems today, and the term around desert ecology is one that I've been very fascinated by. And Kelly, I'd love to learn more about what is desert ecology?
Of course we know ecology is the study of how all of life relates in an ecosystem, which is sort of a region of a way of that plants and animals are interacting. But when you say desert ecology, it's really focused on a desert, which is something where resources are quite different from, say, a forested ecosystem. And so in desert ecology, we're really focused on looking at how different species have adaptations to that. So we have a really extreme climate here. So most of the creatures that live here have adaptations to an extreme climate. And one thing that's unique about desert ecology is that a lot of the species that live here are endemic to the desert, which means that they live nowhere else on the planet but right here because they've had to adapt to that ecosystem.
I love that. And I remember reading about how California's ecosystems are unique because, again, we mentioned we have the mountains, we have the forests, we have the coastal regions, we have the deserts. And there was a report that I think I read recently that said that the desert is actually one of the largest in California carbon sequestration compared to forests, which actually shocked me because I thought that forests actually have the more trees, there's more water, there's more soil, there's more species, but the desert is actually largest, and why is that?
Yeah, well, so the desert is a really large ecosystem in California. It's a quarter of the state. It's massive. We talk a lot about biodiversity in the desert. For example, the biodiversity in the desert is higher than, say, a pine forest in Northern California. So there's actually more different kinds of species here than we have there, which is surprising to people. And also, we don't have large trees, which are these big sort of carbon vacuums, but we have a lot of vegetation, and there is this whole layer of soil that's sort of the crust of our soil that's essentially alive. It's covered in what we call a biological soil crust, which is a sort of web of cyanobacteria and lichen and moss and fungus that sort of is a mat across the desert that helps all of the plants grow here, but it's also holding carbon. And then it's also putting carbon into the roots of the desert. So here we have carbon sequestration works a bit differently. A lot of the carbon is stored underground in plant system roots and in the soil in the form of caliche, which is like a calcium carbonate and that kind of thing. So you don't see it, but it's there.
Wow, now I'm team desert over forest.
Okay, good.
What is your envision of this desert ecosystem in the next 40, 50 years? What do you think will be here, and what do you see for the future?
I know that we're gonna persevere. I feel really confident about it. I'm so lucky to get to wake up every day and dedicate my life and energy to solving this problem, and I get to be surrounded by a lot of smart, creative, innovative people and partners, and we're all working so hard every day. I do see that we're going to have increased development, and we're going to have more people, and we're going to have crunches for water and resources, but I also feel confident that we'll have these massive sort of preserves dedicated to protecting Joshua trees and desert tortoises, and that a climate scientist I spoke to once said, if we really can make some changes now, we're going to see warming for the next 50-ish years. But if we can really hold ourselves to making changes now, after those 50 years, we should see the benefits of that. So I really think about protecting the desert in terms of like, okay, what can we put in place?
Thinking.
Like, yeah, for that 50 years so that we can make it to the other side.
Yeah, because I want to show my kids the tortoises in
Yes.
30, 20 years from now. And, you know, what are the ways that individuals watching this can really get involved with the Mojave Desert Land Trust? Because you all do such great programming initiatives, policy pushing. I mean, I think that a lot of people just look at the desert now, and what are the ways that they can get involved?
We have a really great social media feed we are often putting out action alerts for ways that people can support Joshua Tree conservation or tortoise conservation or all the various sort of policy initiatives that are out there. So as much support as we can get on those is really helpful. And then of course, I have to say, donating to us
Yes.
is really the most powerful thing folks can do. We are built on donations. That's how we run, is people who want to partner with us in really making big change here. In some ways, the more important thing we can do is as we're going about our lives, really, you know, thinking about how we're connected to our ecosystems, whether you're here in the desert or you're in LA or in, you know, Washington, DC, really thinking about how you're impacting the plants and animals around you and how they're providing resources for you every day and what you can do in your daily life to support that.
Absolutely. And come to the desert. I mean, that's the best thing that people can do to build that ecological wealth relationship to the land. Thank you so much again, Kelly, for having me here today. And hopefully everyone that's watching this understands more about desert ecology and the importance of this ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah.
Thank you.
I am always so thrilled to have an opportunity to talk about the desert.
Thank you.
Thanks.